Greetings. In my first installment on the Lord's Prayer in Lashawan Qadash, I covered the version of the prayer which was at 1 West. And now in this second installment, I want to explore how our beloved friend from over at the We Woke Now channel, that is the good doctor, Kelly Richardson, how he introduced new adaptations of the 1 West version of the Lord's Prayer. You see, he has his own congregation, and he's attempted to introduce his congregation to what he presents as an ancient Paleo-Hebrew version of the Lord's Prayer. Now, the good doctor has insinuated in the past that he didn't get Lashawan Qadash from 1 Westers. You see, he tries to give the impression that he simply arrived at Lashawan Qadash just by studying the available evidence, examining the available scholarship, like somehow this is the natural conclusion. But there are a number of dead giveaways that he borrowed this system from 1 Westers. The most glaring example is the fact that he renders the tzadeh, which is to say the 18th character of the Hebrew alphabet, he renders the tzadeh as taza, right? There's zero evidence for the tzadeh ever being rendered taza in antiquity. He also humorously uses Ahraya's Diacritics. You'll notice a little horizontal line that curves upwards at the ends, almost like a little smile. You'll notice that character under certain letters. That goes back to 1 West, right? That's a 1 West diacritic. And we might also note how he renders the Qof as Qua. But putting all that aside, right, and aside from Lashawan Qadash in general, it seems that the good doctor also borrowed his version of the Lord's Prayer from 1 Westers as well. Now, he's made some changes to it to make it his own and, perhaps to try to put a little distance between his version and the 1 West version, but there are still some clues pointing to him getting his base text from the 1 West version. On your screen is a comparison of the 1 West version and Kelly's first version, which he introduced to his congregation in September of 2018. Text that's marked in red on the left side is material which is omitted in Kelly's version, and text which is marked in red on the right side is material which Kelly added. Now, one might want to object that of course, these two versions of the prayer are going to be similar because they're both, allegedly renderings into ancient Paleo-Hebrew. So they're going to reach a lot of the same conclusions, right? I imagine that's the objection that some might want to put forward. But we're going to play a clip of when the good doctor first introduced his version of the prayer back in 2018. And I'm going to offer a few brief comments along the way, noting the specific signs that the good doctor used the 1 West version as his base text. So let's jump right in, beginning with the good doctor's introduction and fair use.
But today, I went on, I was up all night doing this, together the Lord's Prayer, Yahweh Palah, right? I was putting together the Lord's Prayer and put it into the ancient Hebrew, all right? Ahraya, Quadash, all right? That's the term for ancient Hebrew. Quadash is the term for ancient. And I don't use the term paleo anymore because that's still of a Greek influence. But nevertheless, all right, so I went on to put these slides together just so that way when we start our services, guess what? We could start with saying the Most High God's prayer. And then in between, I'm going to go ahead and put together the benediction, Aaron's final blessing. I'm going to put that together between now and as we go and have our feast in a few hours. So, but nevertheless, took me some time putting these letters up here because these are letters that I created myself. So everything you see up here is me doing it from hand, from scratch. These fonts and everything.
Okay, so that makes clear that this is when he first introduced his version of the Lord's Prayer to his congregation. And again, this is in September of 2018. Now let's get into the actual text of the prayer, the actual content.
But nevertheless, start off with Our Father, Abba Nawa, all right? Our Father, Abba Nawa, which is in heaven, Shabbat Yam. Holy Quadash. Be Haya, holy Quadash.
Okay, so to begin, the fact that the good doctor uses Quadash Haya is the first clue that he got this from One Westers. And I covered Quadash Haya, this construction in detail in the first installment on this topic, my first video on this topic. Strangely, however, in the good doctor's version, he inserts Quadash a second time. So rather than Quadash Haya, it's Quadash Haya Quadash. If the good doctor has a good reason for that, he's more than welcome to share it. He's actually invited to explain why he rendered it that way. But honestly, I think it really might just have started out as a sort of typo or a sort of editing error that somehow became part of his congregation's liturgy. Oh, and on a side note, his use of Quadash Haya is, in my opinion, particularly ironic because he often likes to use the scholar Gilad Zuckerman's term, the Israeli language, to refer to modern Israeli Hebrew. But part of the reason that Gilad Zuckerman does that is because in practice, modern Israeli Hebrew syntax is often different from ancient Hebrew syntax. And that's because the modern Israeli Hebrew was adopted by speakers of Germanic languages like Yiddish and English. And as a result, in practice, there's this sort of Germanic or sometimes Slavic syntax that undergirds the language, the reality is that the good doctor's attempts to recreate ancient Hebrew suffer from similar problems. In fact, I'd say it's even worse in his case. And you can see that. You can see these instances where he's thinking in English and then trying to plug Semitic roots into that sort of Germanic matrix. And that's why it's ironic for him to adopt Gilad Zuckerman's phrase, the Israeli language. Maybe we can refer to his as the American language. I don't know. But anyway, let's get back to the clip.
Is your name Ata Shamka?
Your name, Atha Shamka. This is another change that the good doctor introduced, you see, and he inserts the pronoun ata into certain places. He seems to think that because ata means you in Hebrew, it can also be used to mean your. In other words, he's trying to use ata as like a possessive pronoun. Now, some might think that he was actually reaching for the direct object marker, et, but notice that he included the he at the end. He didn't spell it aleph tau, rather he spelled it aleph tau he. That's the pronoun, ata. And even more curious, despite trying to introduce ata as a possessive pronoun, he still kept the possessive suffix at the end of the word for name. So you get this weird construction, atha shamka. But let's continue.
Lord Yahweh, your kingdom, Ata Malakwaka.
Your kingdom, atha malakwaka. I think it's pretty clear that, again, he's trying to introduce ata as a possessive pronoun, which is not how it's used in actual Hebrew. And again, notice how he still keeps the possessive suffix at the end of the word. These are examples of how he's trying to improve the One West version, but his changes are actually making it worse. And that aside, also note how the word he uses for kingdom, right? Let's make a note of that, malachwath, right? That's the Lashawan Qadash rendering of malkut, and I don't have a problem with that, but that's going to come up again when we discuss the revisions of the prayer, which the good doctor has presented to his congregation in subsequent years. So keep that in mind. Initially, he was using malkut, or as he pronounced it, malachwath.
Come, Baba'ah, your will, Adara Taza, in earth, Ba Arataza, as be Kawa Haya.
Kawa Haya. That kaf wa, that's another sign that the good doctor simply adopted the One West version of the prayer and then made some changes to it. As was mentioned in my first video on this topic, in the first installment, the One West leadership apparently started with a standard Hebrew text that used ken, which is to say kaf nun, but it was a final nun, a nun sofit, and one of the One West leaders mistook the nun sofit for a wa, and thus they wrote it down as kaf wa, and that became part of the One West version of the Lord's Prayer. Then, decades later, the good doctor adopted the One West version of the Lord's Prayer, and he made changes to it, but he didn't change this curious kaf wa portion, this kawa portion. And the fact that kawa appears in his prayer as well is, like I said, another sign that he started with the One West version of the prayer.
In heaven, Ba Shamayam, give us Natan La Nawa.
While some might consider this minor, this is yet another sign that the good doctor started with the One West version of the prayer, as he makes the same grammatical mistake that they made with the verb laten, which is the verb to give, right? Clearly, this is intended here as being in the imperative. And as I mentioned in the first installment of this series, the imperative form of laten drops the first root letter, that first nun, right? You see, the root is nun, tau, nun, but that first nun gets dropped when, that first root letter gets dropped when the verb is rendered in the imperative. And the example I gave in my first video was Genesis 14:21, when the king of Sodom says to Abram, ten li, give to me. The good doctor's version of the prayer includes the same grammatical mistake that the One West version had, and that's because the good doctor lifted most of his text from their version.
Bread all day, lakam, kal, yawam. Forgive us, wa salak, la nawa, our debts, ka, wab, wa, ta, nawa, ka, wab, nawa, as we forgive, let me read it from here, ka, salak, nawa, our debtors, ka, wab, wa, ya, nawa.
And I would say this is yet another element borrowed from the One West prayer. This isn't something I mentioned in my first video, but nonetheless, both the One West version and Kelly's original version just have hobotenu twice, seemingly like saying, forgive us our debts as we forgave our debts. But I also wanted to mention this because, as we'll see in a bit, in a later revision of the prayer that the good doctor introduced to his congregation, he tries to correct this. And honestly, again, he only makes it worse. You'll see he'll wind up introducing a different word, a word which is unambiguously masculine, but he keeps the mem in the plural suffix, and yet he also places a possessive suffix after it. And that's because he doesn't understand how masculine plural nouns are rendered in the construct state, such as, with a possessive suffix. But again, we'll see that in a bit, we'll see that a bit later when we get to his revision.
And not wala, all right? Lead us, tabaya, nawa, in temptation, bana saw ya nawa, but deliver us, abal ha shai nawa. I'll say it again, abal ha shai nawa, from evil, ma yan rai. For to you, ka, the kingdom, ha, malak, yaf, and the power, waha, Allah.
Okay, using Allah or El for power in the supplemental doxology of the prayer is yet another sign that this is an adaptation of the One West version of the prayer. One West loves to insist that the word El, which is usually understood to mean God, they insist that the word El ultimately and primarily just means power. And because they put emphasis on that definition, they therefore wound up using El, which they pronounce Allah or Allah, as the translation of power in the doxological statement, which is appended to certain versions of the Lord's Prayer. Now, along comes the good doctor, who later changes that in his revised version. But the fact that Allah or Allah appeared in his original version shows yet again that his source text was the One West version of the prayer.
And the glory, waha tapa'a wrath, forever, la I wa lam yam. Amen. Amen. Hallelujah. So that is the Lord's Prayer in ancient Hebrew.
Okay, so like I mentioned earlier, that footage is from September of 2018 when the good doctor first introduced his version of the Lord's Prayer to his congregation. And as I noted, the good doctor has tried to revise the prayer in the years since then. But with all due respect, the revisions have made it worse. I'm sorry if that sounds repetitious, but that really is the case. Now, on your screen, you see a comparison of the two versions, which we'll be examining in this video. On the left is the version which we just looked at, the original version which he introduced in 2018, and on the right is the latest version. Now I call it the second version because it's the second version we'll be looking at in this video, but really there were intermediary versions in between, intermediate versions, intermediate revisions, between these two versions. And so perhaps what follows is really his third version, if not his fourth version. I don't know. Whatever the case, we're now going to take a look at a video from April of last year, and the version of the prayer in this clip is the current version used by the congregation, as can be heard in a video from just last month titled Passover, Corporate Celebration. But unfortunately, one can't see the text on the screen in that more recent video as the crowd is blocking the view, hence why we'll be looking at this clip from April of 2022. But I'll share links to both videos in the description, for anyone who might want to listen to that more recent video and confirm that the prayer is the same. Also, I'll place a transcription of this version of the prayer into the standard Hebrew characters, into the Ashuri script on the right-hand side of the screen. And, by the way, a different member of the congregation is going to lead the prayer in this clip, but nonetheless, you can be certain that this was introduced by Kelly. So here we go. And again, fair use.
No, that's not the first one.
Oh, no, it's not. Our Father.
See, I'm testing y'all. Am I? The first one goes, Our Father,
Abba Nawa,
which in heaven,
Shabbat Shamayam,
holy,
Quadash,
be
Haya,
holy,
Quadash,
is your name,
Ata Shamka,
Lord
Yahweh,
your kingdom,
Ata Mamalak Wa.
All right, this is an interesting portion. Notice how they said Mamalakwath, which would be spelled with 6 characters, yet on the screen they only have 4 characters, which they would pronounce Mamalak. So to explain what's going on here, originally in the first version they had Malkut, which they pronounce Malakwath, or more specifically they had it with the second person possessive suffix, so Malkutecha, or as they pronounce it, Malachwathka. But then over time they dropped the possessive suffix and they transitioned to the plural of an alternative word for kingdom, that being Mamlaka, and the plural of Mamlaka is Mamlekot, but they pronounce Mamlekot as Mamalachwath. But then, at some point, they tried to reduce that Hebrew term to its singular form, yet they left off the hey. In other words, the Hebrew word that the good doctor was reaching for here should be spelled mem mem lamed kaf hey. But in perhaps a bit of a typo or an editing error, he only has mem mem lamed kaf on the screen. Meanwhile, they didn't update the Latin transcription, and because the congregation isn't actually looking at the Hebrew text, rather they're looking at the Latin transcription, they're still saying Mamalachwath, even though Mamalach is what, how they would pronounce the Hebrew characters on the screen.
come,
Taba,
your will,
Ra Tazah,
in earth,
Ba'ara Tazah,
as be
Hawa Haya,
in heaven.
Ba Shamayam,
Give us
Nathan Lanawa.
And here we are back to Nathan Lanawa. But this time, notice the curious fact that the good doctor has strangely separated the lamed preposition from the pronominal suffix that follows. And then he put a hey on the lamed. I'm honestly not sure what he was thinking there, but this does not seem to be a mere typo, as he made this revision multiple times. He did it at least twice. We're going to see another example in a moment. Now, the One West version had a grammatical error, and now the good doctor tries to improve on it, yet he keeps the grammatical error and still makes it worse with this bizarre situation where the lamed has a hey after it, and it's disconnected from the suffix. I don't know.
bread all day,
Lakam Kala Yawam,
forgive us,
Salat Lanawa.
And there's another example of what I was just referring to. Here they're trying to say salach lanu, but they detached the lamed preposition in lanu from the pronominal suffix, and then again they added a hey to that lamed. I don't know. It's again I'm not sure what Kelly was thinking here. If anyone wants to take a guess, feel free to share it in the comment section. And of course, the good doctor's invited to explain what he intended here.
Our debts,
SHABBATH now.
as forgive we.
Khamr kana anak now.
Okay, this is curious. I'm not sure what verb the good doctor was reaching for here. My guess is that it was probably the verb limchol, but in another one of these editing errors, perhaps the lamed in limchol got replaced by a nun. That's my guess. Another perhaps less likely possibility is that he was attempting some sort of participle form from the chet nun nun root. But either way, even without trying to give him a hard time about the root, as like I said, there might have been a typo here. So putting aside the problems with the verbal root, notice the way the verb is rendered. For example, while this is unlikely, if the verb was intended to be in the perfect tense, why include the pronoun anachnu instead of the standard suffix that would go with a first person plural rendering? However, I think it's more likely that he sort of intended, the present tense, and thus perhaps what would be appropriate here, or what he was unwittingly reaching for here, is a participle form of the verb, right? But even then, why isn't it rendered in the masculine plural to go along with the pronoun? Like, for example, I previously mentioned the verb limchol. Perhaps one could have put anachnu mochlim, we forgive, or we are the forgivers, something like that. But again, I find this part confusing. And so, like I said earlier, if others want to try to make sense of this, try to make sense of what was intended here, offer some thoughts on that, let me know in the comment section.
Our debtors,
Kata yam now.
Okay, I alluded to this earlier when discussing the first version's use of hobotenu. He replaces that second use of hobotenu with hotim, but if one is going to include the possessive suffix, the masculine plural noun should be in the construct state, which is to say that final mem should not be there. This is something that the good doctor has consistently shown that he's not aware of. He doesn't understand what masculine plural nouns look like in the construct state. Or, if you want to keep that mem on the plural noun, then maybe put a lamed preposition after it, like chotim lanu, those who are sinners to us, something like that. I don't know.
and not
Wala'ah.
lead us
Nakat nawa.
in temptation,
Ba Masa.
but deliver us.
Anai Hawshai Ayah.
Okay, there were like 3 different curiosities in the excerpt we just watched, the curious verbal root, but putting it tau instead of a hey, I don't know. But in the interest of brevity, I'll only note that here he replaced abal with ana, and I'm honestly not sure why.
From evil.
Mayan Ra'ai.
For to you,
Lakam.
Okay, minor note here in the doxological appendix to the prayer, he switched from a singular suffix to a plural suffix, right? So now it reads to you, plural. I'm not sure if that was merely an editing error or if he intended some sort of theological point. And I could go on, but it might be best to stop here. I want to take this moment to make clear that the point of this video and the previous video was not to just pick on people who are still learning Hebrew. I myself am just a low-level student, right? Rather, the point here is that these different men, whether it be the One West leaders or the good doctor, these men prop themselves up as authoritative teachers who know the true Hebrew. But really, all they're doing is grabbing text from standard forms of Hebrew, the forms of Hebrew which they publicly revile, and then they try to revise those texts. But more often than not, their revisions wind up making things worse. One West took a standard Hebrew translation of the Lord's Prayer and made it worse. Then the good doctor tried to adapt and revise the One West version, and he made it even worse. Then he revised his own revision, and the resulting meta-revision made it worse still. And this keeps happening precisely because their claims of knowing the true Hebrew are mere bluffs. And for that reason, it's worth documenting their actual struggles with the language and how their missteps reveal how little they actually know. And with that, I'll close this video here. As always, I welcome any comments, questions, or criticisms. I don't censor anyone here, so feel free to share your thoughts, whether positive or negative. I'm going to just end this video by letting the rest of the clip play. So enjoy, be well, and God bless.
the kingdom
Ha Mamalak.
and the power
Waha Ka'ak.
and the glory
Waha Kabah.
forever.
I will Yom.
Amen. Amen. And for those of you who are here for the first time, We read it in ancient Paleo Hebrew, and that's the English at the top, and then we pronounce it at the bottom. And then this is how it's written in the ancient language. Amen? Amen. Sweet